Ladies and gentlemen, a real pleasure to introduce one of the true gentlemen of the sports corporate world. A man who, in the most tumultuous time of the Essendon Football Club, stepped into a very, very precarious situation and stepped up to the plate and got them through as the interim CEO of Essendon. Worked also as a CFO at Southern Cross Stereo, the biggest FM radio conglomerate across the country. Worked also with the Tats groups, and now runs the books at the AFL just down the road, the big sporting mecca in this city and this country. The Chief Financial Officer of the AFL, and Jack Gunston's dad as well, the Hawthorn champ, Mr. Ray Gunston.
Thanks, mate. Thank you very much. And for those of you who do follow football, as I've just been introduced, I'm better known as the father of Jack. So a bit self-indulgent, I put him on the slide because I can, I guess. But so I apologise for that, but I don't really. I'm very proud of him. And it is my moniker in life, but I'm really happy with it. I'm just going to quickly, I guess, put a context and run through a few of the specific decisions, but I'm going to put it in the context of the strategy of the AFL and where we're heading. All of the big decisions are made within essentially 6 pillars that are driving us towards our vision of being the number one sporting and entertainment offering in Australia. What we want is 18 strong clubs that are viable financially, can win any week, and have their own vibrant identity. In the context of a spectacular game and an exciting competition, we want the best players, we want the best paid players, we want the best athletes playing our game, well officiated, playing in the best stadia with the best in-stadia experience and at-game experience with great integrity and reputation. We want a strong industry, one that's got a really strong cost discipline, something that I'm spending a lot of time on at the moment to make sure that we're matching the revenues and the expenses. Some sports in this country have found themselves being forced to reorganise much earlier than they'd like because they're not focusing on their ability to have an affordable game or affordable sport. And as a not-for-profit operation, we put everything back into the game, into the community football, into all forms of football. In the context of that, we're a sport that is totally responsible for the game in its totality, including community football, and we need to make sure that our game is connected to community, that we grow participation, we grow clubs, we grow leagues across the country, and that we have an elite women's sport and a second-tier competition. One of our biggest challenges is to make sure we continue to be relevant to the changing demographics of Australia. So we need to make sure that we've got a diverse fan base that's reflecting the changing face of Australia, that we're engaging kids with our next generation of fans. It's a game for women as well as men, and that we're using technology to drive new consumption of the game. It's a big challenge for us. It's a big future investment for us to make sure that we're relevant to the ever-changing demographics of Australia and that we're moving very quickly and investing in technology, something we haven't done as well as we'd like. We've got an opportunity to do that, but as you know, in any sport, the ability to actually make big investment decisions is a real challenge, and one that I'm dealing with at the moment and enjoying, but it's a tussle to compete against today's spend, or to spend to make sure the future of your game is secure and stable. And the only way to do that is to make sure we've got good people right throughout our organisation at the AFL and through the clubs, and that we're looking after the volunteers that look after our game and make our game work. In that sense, when we talk about big decisions, here's a few of them. There's many more, but there's the media rights deals that we do, which are critical, represent probably in the order now of about 30%, or will represent about 30% of our total revenue for the industry going forward. The collective pay, the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement with players. Players are a really important asset to us. We need to make sure that they are the best paid group of athletes in Australia. What we've called an industry investment model. I'm spending a lot of time now after the media rights deal looking at the allocation of that money and holding some back to make the big investment decisions across players, clubs, fans and the community. Major investments such as the expansion clubs that were invested in, the very exciting implementation of a National Women's League, laws of the game changes and investment in infrastructure are just some of the big decisions that are required to be made and need the data to inform those decisions. I'll deal with a few of those. Clearly I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to work through it pretty quickly. But in relation to club funding, which is a really critical part of our industry, this is currently being reviewed after last year's media rights deal. What we have is 18 individually governed clubs with 18 different governance structures, 18 different business models, varying revenue generating capabilities. The task is to make sure that they're viable, that they're competitive, and that requires us to balance out the funding from our centralised revenues to ensure that we've got 18 viable clubs. One of the approaches in doing that is to look at the structural inequalities that exist across our industry, given the differing histories, locations and structures of those clubs, to try and attempt to get a data-based approach to the way that we allocate those funds. And we're still working through this piece of work at the moment, but to give you a feel for the sort of work and the extent of the analytics that are going into this, we've identified in broad terms 5 major structural inequalities that exist between our clubs. There's the supporter base, and obviously some of the larger Melbourne clubs have significant supporter bases on which to draw. The fixture that we put out each year is a major value driver or differential value driver amongst clubs in the competition. Stadium economics vary around the country depending on ownership and age and vintage and the structure and a variety of elements associated with the relativity of the size of that stadium to the geography and the demographic. Other football revenue, predominantly access to gaming, but also some clubs are branching into health, gyms and those types of things, and cost inequalities. So I don't have time to go through all of this, but in essence, off the supporter base, you get a really significant differential in relation to value driving out of attendance at matches and audience through media. And that translates through in terms of the translation of those supporters into attendance or to audience around media, into the ability to drive revenue in membership and match receipts and sponsorship and signage. The fixture, particularly the home ground attendance, obviously is driven by opponents that will drive membership and match receipts. The media audience will be driven by opponents, time slots and access to free-to-air. So there's a big dynamic of various factors driving both supporter base sizes as they flow into revenue bases and fixtures. Stadium economics can vary anywhere from 35 cents in the dollar to 80 cents in the dollar, so it's a major structural difference between our clubs. And then other football revenue and cost inequalities are more, if you like, accounting rather than data-based type of analysis. But just as a snapshot to show you how important this can be, if you just look at the comparison of club supporter bases and the regression associated with the relationship between club resource, net revenue and number of avid supporters, you can see how critical supporter size is to the viability and revenue generating capability of a club. And just to take the snapshot of the audience benefit, what we've done is to work out the club uplift in the number of viewers per game by looking at the relationship between TV audience sizes relative to the supporter base size. We obviously work that through the number of games to work out the number of viewers driven by the supporter base. We've done a lot of work with outside assistance in valuing those viewers, which gives us a value of the audience. We compare that against an average value to just assess what the relative audience advantage is from a supporter base. So this is the type of analytical work that's going on to try and then get into a position where we can assess the negative and the positive position based around the structural advantage or disadvantages of clubs to give us, as you can see on the right-hand side, some assessment of the relative position of our clubs in the context of their ability to generate revenue, generate profitability, which, as we've looked at this, found that those structural advantages or disadvantages really do match up quite neatly with the club-sourced revenue that's being generated. So these are becoming the mantras or the elements or the pillars upon which we'll take our funding structures going forward and work out the differential funding. Clearly there will be differences based around on-field performance, elasticity demand, difference in management effectiveness as of experience at a particular club, and imperfections in the calculation of some of these inequalities. So there'll need to be discretionary elements put around this, but we're trying to create a transparency around a strong analytical basis that we can then talk to our clubs about and give them confidence in the way we're going about it. So that's just an example, a very quick example of a hell of a lot of work that's going on right at the moment as we work through the funding structures for our clubs. Always dangerous to give a finance bloke an opportunity to talk about the laws of the game, but every decision that the AFL makes about the laws of the game is a big decision. When you consider that the media coverage we've gotten is something like, I think, 1,700 accredited media people in the AFL, every time you mention laws of the game, it gets huge coverage. So it's always a big decision, doesn't matter how small it is. To give you a bit of a feel for the way we go about some of these decisions, the use of data from three key drivers are what sort of inform the decision making. That's fan research, and we've got a base of about 1,100 potential participants in an online format that give us a fan focus towards rule changes and rules, and they give it pretty strongly. Industry consultation with various stakeholders, coaches, doctors, players, and various representatives around the competition, and then a very strong analytical base in relation to welfare and game research that we get from champion data, match statistics, industry tracking data, and the sort of GPS data that you were just presented about in the previous presentation. So they form the three sorts of things. So what I thought I'd do is quickly talk about a little bit about, to inform that, the history of the interchange cap and substitute rules. For those of you who don't follow football, and I suggest there's probably not many in here, but we do have 22 players in a team on a match day, of which 18 are actually on the ground at any time and 4 are off the ground. And that's been the case for a long time, unless you're someone as old as I who played when we only had 2 on the bench and didn't get rotated until they decided you could come on 5 minutes before the end of the game. So we've had this position where, with the 4 interchange for quite a long period of time, coaches and sports scientists, as they've expanded into our sport, we're increasingly using sophistication around the way they use those rotations. Primarily grew them quite dramatically, but sophisticated in the way they used them. So what we needed to do was to put a lens on the fact, on that development in the context of the 3 lenses that we put around these things, which is injury, fairness and game style. And I'll talk a little bit through this, but where we ended up was, or where we got to after years of, I guess, unregulated interchange use, was to introduce an interchange cap of 120 just in 14. Prior to that, in 11, we introduced a substitute which meant that one of those four could only be brought into the game at one point in time, and the person that they replaced was out of the game. So it was reducing, if you like, the ability to interchange in terms of the numbers and reduce the impact of losing a player to injury. So in terms of taking an injury perspective to that decision, we first determined if that cap was required. We looked at injury reports and champion data statistics around rotations to determine whether the number of club rotations were correlated with injury. It became quite clear that as the amount of rotations were increasing, so were the amount of injuries. The introduction of the substitute rule, as you can see with the red part, really did not seem to make a significant difference. In fact, presented probably a much higher data spread. So certainly from the point of view of injury per se, the amount of rotations was quite a critical element that we needed to consider. In the context of a fairness perspective, through the fairness lens, the data showed a substitute largely correlated with or corrected any unfairness from a game-ending injury. Obviously, what happened, if you were one down in terms of a game-ending injury, you were down on rotations. The restriction of having one substitute rather than having four interchange players meant that sides were restricted in the context of their ability to take the benefit of a game-ending injury. So clubs that had a game-ending injury now with the substitute had a better chance to win with that substitute. Putting the game style lens around the decision, we looked at match vision initially and then later GPS in the context of working out player density. As you can see from the table on the right-hand side, from around 2006 onwards, the density and the way that the coaches and the sports scientists were using the interchange capability led to a position where there was much stronger and greater density in the game, which from a fan perspective was not really attractive at all. So as a result of those three lenses, we decided, the AFL put in place an interchange cap of 120. That brought that down marginally. The one thing that just told us was that clubs were able to do it without affecting player loads or management of players, but really didn't solve the issues that we had, which were primarily around the fact of, as you can see in the top right-hand side, what we would call congestion type statistics were all still up in the context of secondary stoppages being up, ball ups being up and free kicks being up. So we still had the issue of the game was being clogged up, was becoming unattractive, and scoring was low. And the fan feedback was that was an unattractive element. So we needed to address that. What we've done for this season was to remove the substitute, bring in a cap for 90, reduce that interchange cap to 90. And what we've found, certainly from a statistic viewpoint, is that stoppages are down, contested marks are up, we're getting a lot more scoring, we're getting closer games, and on all other statistics, people are loving our game. So that's another example. As I said, always dangerous for someone like me to be talking about this stuff, but it's clearly using the data and using the improved data we have available to us through various lenses. I think we've landed in a pretty good place on that. Back to some economics, but looking at expanding into New South Wales and Queensland, particularly in relation to expanding our presence with our expansion teams of Western Sydney and Gold Coast. A little bit more sedate use of data, but it was pretty compelling back before we made those decisions. When you looked at the population in New South Wales and Queensland, you look at the GDP numbers, you look at the numbers of head offices and look at the TV revenue, it's a no-brainer that we needed to make sure that we had increased penetration and increased exposure into those markets. Supplemented here, I guess, by the numbers around that time in terms of the Australian population and the amount of people in New South Wales. And Queensland expected to overtake Victoria in terms of population by 2030. All of that, which has been found to be the case, we felt, and our view was that off the base of this, we'd be in a position where we could obviously put a 9th game in with 18 teams from 16 teams, which provided another time slot, another ability to leverage up the media rights, the increased sponsorship income that we've clearly seen flow through, because now we've got a national exposure, we've got a game in those states every week rather than every second week, has bolstered up sponsorship income through our major sponsors and helped the clubs with their sponsorship. Government, in terms of government funding, we've seen a significant increase in funding both into those into our existing jurisdictions as into the new ones as well, and generally seen huge advantage out of that. From this chart, you can see we've been able to grow through various economic environments. I guess the challenge for me coming into this role is that I don't think I can bring another team in at the moment, so I'm going to have to find other ways to make sure this looks okay. And in the context of outcomes, you can see them up there, but the one I would point you to, which is critical to our future, is the participation numbers. And you can see there that since 2007 to today, our participation numbers have increased dramatically in our non-historical markets, which is significant for us. Participation in sport in our game effectively gives you about an improvement of about 7% in relation to your ability, you're 7 times more likely as a participant to actually go and watch the game. So if we can continue to grow that participation in these newer markets, that's going to be what's going to drive us going forward and sustain the business. Finally, in relation to another big decision that was taken last year, and which is really pleasingly on fire at the moment, is our Women's League. Again, the first factor in actually making sure this worked was making sure we had the talent. So we mined our talent data to make sure that we had enough players at a suitable level to get us in, and to enable us to have a competition that was going to be interesting to people to watch. There was no question that it was going to be interesting for the people to participate, but we needed to make sure we had a product. As you can see, Queensland, Western Australia and Victoria have provided the major elements of that and certainly underpinned our ability to then issue licences, 4 licences into Victoria, 1 into Queensland, 1 into Western Australia. South Australia is an historically strong football base, so that's combined with the Northern Territory to provide a licence into Adelaide, and we needed to be in New South Wales, and we'll make sure that. But the pleasing thing, particularly with Queensland, is the amount of players in academies. So off the back of that ability to actually have talent, we assessed, and we've been using research to assess what sort of product people are looking for, and what we've got is that people actually don't know what they're expecting, but they're very excited, which is great for us. But what we've been told very clearly is it's critical we don't lose the essence of the game. So we've got to make sure that we maintain that in the context of any rules and everything else that we put in place. Now what we're looking at in the context of what the specific nature of the game might be from a female game and a women's game is that from the stats on the right-hand side, you can see that things like secondary stoppages, tackles, it's a more congested game, and these are probably the stats you would have got if you look more at them. These are compared to the men's game today. They would have been less if you had gone back to the congestion that we had a little while ago. But what is interesting is that it is more of a positional, congested game. The heat maps from GPS data on the right-hand side show you that on the top right-hand side of those heat maps, That's a larger ground. There's less spread and it tends to just go around one side because the game doesn't spread. The middle heat map on the right-hand side is on a smaller ground, and you can see we get much better spread. So there are these sorts of analysis that's being done just at the moment to work out whether and if we are going to have game changes, what the size of the ground should be, but recognising our research tells us that we must ensure the game doesn't lose its integrity. So again, they're all factors that we use. They're all leading from an analytic or from a performance view within the AFL. These are the types of measures that we continue to look at in the context of data. And when all else fails, at the moment we're trying to work out what our revenue will be from the finals. There's a heap of data, but in the end, at the moment, I'm looking at the betting odds to tell me who might be in the final 8 so I can work out what my finals revenue would be. So it doesn't matter how much data analytics you do, sometimes you've got to go to market. Thanks very much.
Oh, how about it? As I say, one of the true gentlemen of the corporate world, Mr. Ray Gunston. And if his son Jack keeps kicking straight, going to make a lot of money in the finals with Hawthorn looking at 4 in a row to equal Collingwood. 4 premierships in a row. All right. How about now, Ilmar, how are we going for time, you reckon? A couple of questions. All right, put your hand up if you've got a question, and I'll come over this young lad here. Some questions for Ray Gunston, the CFO of the AFL.
Game, and these are probably the stats you would have got if you looked more at them. These are compared to the men's game today. They would have been less if you had gone back to the congestion that we had a little while ago. But what is interesting is that it is more of a positional, congested game. The heat maps from GPS data on the right-hand side show you that on the top right-hand side of those heat maps, that's a larger ground. There's less spread and it tends to just go around one side because the game doesn't spread. The middle heat map on the right-hand side is on a smaller ground, and you can see we get much better spread.
Just up here for fun.
And his father was a commissioner until recently. So, well, thanks for being here, Tim.
Great stuff, well done. Big round of applause for Tim there. Great stuff. Come all the way from New South Wales. We'll spin the camera around this young man here. If you could introduce yourself and question for Ray.
Sure. Good morning, Ray. My name is Mesut, and I'm the IBM client executive looking after the sports and entertainment industry here in Melbourne. Thanks a lot for the overview that you provided in the strategic direction you guys are heading towards. My question is around data. You mentioned that the AFL make a lot of important decisions, and obviously it's based around financial data, data from the community, social data, your 50% investment in champion data, player data, club data, etc. So the question that I have for you is, if yourself and the AFL organisation had the power of artificial intelligence or the power of cognitive computing in the palm of your hands, how would the AFL leverage that? And more importantly, why, if you see it applicable?
Wow. Didn't expect that question today. Look, I'm not sure how to exactly answer that, but one of the things that this is my personal response to that in a more generic sense, is that one of the things that's really critical for us as a sport going forward is to make sure we're relevant to our community. And our community is dramatically changing in terms of the demographic, so what we've got to learn to do better is messaging of our sport. We believe we've got the best sport here. The best way to do that is to communicate. So in the context of what you just put before me, what I'd love to get out of all of that is an ability for us to speak to the ever-changing dynamics of the country that we live in, so that our game becomes more relevant. And one of the things we've got to do
data from the community, social data, your 50% investment in champion data, player data, club data, etc. So the question that I have for you is, if yourself and the AFL organisation had the power of artificial intelligence